Darkly Splendid Abodes, the official podcast of Toronto Thelema. Exploring, if you will, practical philosophy, from science and the workings of the mind to spirituality, esotericism, and magic. Stooping down, dipping my wings, I came into the darkly splendid abodes. The book of the law foretold of one to come, who would discover the key to its ciphers, and Crowley would come to believe this so-called child of the prophet was in fact Charles Stansfeld Jones. In his Liber 31, Jones would recount his discovery of the key word that unlocks the book of the law. Join us as we explore this short but highly Kabbalistic text. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
Love is the law, love under will.
We are in for it. So today we are, we decided...
Let him have it.
I guess the idea was, I think it was you who noticed that we had Frater Achad coming up. That's Charles Stansfeld Jones, also known as Jesus Stansfeld Christ. Also known as...
Really?
I think it was Russell, what's his face? Russell, who called him that.
Oh, wow.
Because Crowley was going on about him all the time.
Catty.
Yeah. So I think, as I was saying, I think it was you who noticed him coming up quite a bit this term. this season.
This session.
Yeah. This season of our deep dips, we had been sort of indirectly referring to him. And so I think it was your idea that maybe we should just get it out of our system and do a couple of these just on him or his writings.
Not a figure I've ever been particularly interested in, and I don't even know why, because the idea that Crowley should have a magical son seems like it should be interesting. I think I got distracted by the idea that they had a falling out, which maybe meant that you have to pick sides, like when
exactly.
Like when your friends break up and you like him more than you like her, so you
Plus, I want to be the magical child.
Oh, I see.
You know? Well, I mean, subconsciously.
Okay.
I don't think this is like I think consciously, I think it's a ridiculous notion to buy into that kind of thing it's clearly egotism and egomaniacal or whatever, megalomaniacal.
Megalotistical.
Megalotistical. But I think subconsciously I want to be, important. And I think that's probably a common notion that a lot of people have. So maybe that's part of it too.
Maybe. I also think that I had heard some stuff about, Thelema Coast to Coast had done an interview with one of his adopted children, or was it a grandchild? No, it was maybe one of his kids.
Yeah, they had a bunch of, him and his wife had a bunch of adopted children.
Yeah, and so this idea of like a reluctant Catholic hosting church meetings in his living room, never like hugging his children, and then disappearing after dinner to do whatever, which at the time I thought maybe, Enochian work or something. Mm-hmm. I didn't, he seemed kind of like a little bit like a hermit to me and like kind of lonely, and I didn't find it that inspiring. And I suppose that was maybe he was doing Great Brotherhood of God stuff at that time, but he never really touched me as a Thelema person. But there's stuff in here. We're going to look at his Liber 31 today, which is confusing because the photocopies of the manuscript of Liber Al are also called Liber 31, whereas the published typescript is called Liber 220, I think.
Yeah, and I think this probably came first before the typescript started being called, Or, sorry, not the typescript,
before the manuscript started being called 31?
I think so. I would imagine so, because I think the whole idea of 31 being important came from this and from these discoveries.
Oh, okay. Cool.
I could be mistaken. Keep in mind, people listening, that we can be mistaken at any point.
Well, this is pretty... there've already been 2 publications of Liberal by now, I think in the Equinox and in the book that is called Thelema. Was it a part of that?
Yeah.
And I think in the first publication it was Liber L. By the second, like just Liber Lamed.
You know
what? By
what?
the second publication, it was already called Liber Aleph Lamed.
Yeah, I was just looking at the Equinox Volume 1, Number 7, because Achad, I'm going to refer to him as Frater Achad, because we need to zero in on one name.
He likes to call himself Parzival all through this, so maybe would it be easier to say Parzival, so we're not using too many names?
Sure. He refers to the Equinox Volume 1, Number 7. I think he refers to it as Volume 7, but I think, at the time, this is what we had for the Equinox, so it just kind of makes sense. So it was kind of a vague reference to some kind of comment, but I was looking all through it, and I couldn't find what he was referring to. And he was just going off the top of his head, I think, from memory, so he might have even been mistaken, but I'm not sure exactly what particular book within there he was referring to. But my point being that's where Crowley had published the manuscript. I just want to take a look at this and see, just to be sure, because it would be interesting to discover if it was still called Liber 31, even at that time, and what would have motivated that. Yep, so it's the manuscript, but it's listed here as Liber L, as you've stated.
Oh, okay, so even in the Equinox, it's still Liber L.
Mm-hmm. And it's Subfigura 220.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's not giving it as Liber 31 yet, which makes total sense. Like I say, I think this is where Parzival has discovered the key to the Book of the Law.
This naming thing is going to be a mess.
It is, yeah. But I'll get there. Yeah, so the keyword we're referring to is L, but not the letter L, the god name L. So Aleph Lamed.
Yeah, so we're segueing here from our previous discussion about Lushtal, or Lashtal, I think we were saying, which was Lo Ale, and now and that idea supposedly came from this, from Liber 31. So we're going here, and we have Lo and L, but we don't have the Shin Teth. So that's was a little bit surprising, but we still get lots of mileage out of just the two words. So we should be fine.
Yeah, I think the Shin Teth, or even more precisely, it was originally, I believe, Sigma Theta. And I think that comes from Crowley's elaboration upon this.
Okay.
It's an intricate web going on here.
I wasn't sure whether to save this kind of tangent for like a chat back episode, but it's unbelievable how difficult this type of material is. It's not surprising that people get it wrong or get lazy about it or something, because it's hard enough just to read Magick Without Tears, or one of the papers where Crowley is doing his best to just tell you what he thinks in pretty plain language.
Yeah.
Because he's very articulate and very funny, and he really enjoys writing, and that joy comes through, but the subject matter is difficult anyway, and his illustrations, because the subject matter is difficult, the illustrations are difficult. But if you actually sort of try to start chasing down some of these the context of how the work of Thelema was being done in this period, like during Crowley's lifetime, you're doing the real work of a historian, chasing down diary fragments and correspondence, and from people from all different sources of people who are maybe have literary talents to varying degrees or different ideas about how to approach things. And so there's stuff in here that's really, really foundational and like just sort of how I think about it.
Yeah.
And so it's cool to see where it originally comes from, not from Crowley, but from Jones. And then Crowley gets very inspired by it. But there's about 4 dates in here and conflicting information about what has happened on those dates. And he refers sort of opaquely to other places where things are written or to things Crowley said to him that he doesn't want to elaborate on because he knows Crowley's going to read it and he doesn't want to come off too bitchy, like he's sort of being a bit passive aggressive. And so there's real, you have to have some background, some, if not background in history, at least some understanding of what historical tools are to begin to approach this stuff. And I mean, you and I both, we were both sort of conservatory school, I think. I did 1 year of university and then I did art school conservatory, and I think you kind of did the same thing.
I dropped out in high school and ended up going to film school much later.
So ill-equipped for academia, but here we are.
So yeah, if anybody wants to rip us apart and everything like that, we'll be glad to ignore you.
Well, here's the problem. This is why I wanted to maybe save it for a talkback episode, but the people that do have academic backgrounds, when they come to this material, they do just as poorly.
Yeah.
And why is it? Is it because they think they can get away with it? Like, are they lying to us on purpose? Or we know they have access to the texts. We know they're smart enough to understand them, and they just don't. They choose not to. It's very, very weird.
So I think it's important for us to establish, as much as I hate having to do too much kind of laying the groundwork, just really briefly, this is Frater Achad. I did it. Parzival.
Let's just, we probably won't call him, IOVVOI by accident.
Stop and think about it for a second.
So his name is Jones or Achad or Parzival.
Any of those
will
work.
And again, L-A is low or la, and it means not. A-L is Al or L, and it means God. So write that down.
Yeah.
Put it next to your computer.
Keep that in the forefront of your mind. But actually, and on that point, just to set the stage, maybe we can start with the fact that the reason Charles Stansfeld Jones has so many names that he's known by, particularly in this and a few other papers, is that these are his initiatory names. So he was one of the earlier members of the AA, and he was initially a student of JFC Fuller, and then when JFC Fuller left the AA, Crowley basically took him directly.
Was he Fuller's student?
Yeah.
That's Fuller? Fucking all that up that hard? Those diary notes are disastrous until Crowley takes them over. That's Fuller? Yeah. Fuller had no idea what he was doing.
So that was the master of the temple, where Achad's diary entries were published in the Equinox 3:1, and as the master of the temple. And yeah, initially it was Fuller who was his neophyte. And from what I understand, Achad took the Oath of the Abyss while he himself was a neophyte, which was a pretty ballsy thing to do. And Crowley attributed his apparent success with, he attributed it to Thelema and the Book of the Law as being a much more efficient and effective spiritual passage of progress. And then you can easily argue that there was, like we were talking about the fact that you feel obligated to take sides. So when there's a falling out between people, so taking Crowley's side, you'd be tempted to think that Achad must have gone off the rails and all this sort of thing as a result of having taken the Oath of the Abyss so early on. And hey, maybe that's part of it. There was a period there where he was spending time in a mental institute in 1917, and that's actually referred to in this indirectly.
Is it?
Yeah, that's the portion where he's talking about having been found himself, thinking he was amongst Buddhas and the enlightened, and then in fact he was actually amongst the filth of the earth.
Oh.
So this is him, and he's talking about it being a prison when he thought he was free, but it's actually a mental institution. So apparently, just looking at, I don't know the full details or anything like that, but apparently he was, some incident happened where he was acting very erratically in a hotel, and he ended up being committed, but I think they also accused him of being a draft dodger and pretending to be crazy.
It never occurred to me to take that literally. Holy smokes. Well, I'm learning all kinds of new stuff today. And so this thing that happens in 1916, June 21st, 1916, that's concurrent with his neophyte period?
This is the difficulty of it. It's like, because he refers right off the bat with this paper. He quotes something that he received in 1912, Era Vulgaris. And that was obviously much earlier on. I think he initially was made a probationer in, I want to say 1909, but I don't know if it was that early or if it would have been 1912. And I'm not 100% on all of these dates.
But he doesn't work his way up through the grades that quickly, so by 1916 he's still a neophyte and decides to take the Oath of the Abyss.
I guess so. I guess that's what we can infer.
That's the story we're building.
Mm-hmm. And again, we're mainly going by this paper rather than going, doing a lot of digging into other things as well.
So just give me a second here, because I'm very curious.
Are you digging into other things as well? So this paper, Liber 31, while you're looking that up, I'll just set the stage here. This is, once he's attained the Master of the Temple status, he has this incredible revelation that builds upon itself, and he discovers the keyword to the Book of the Law, as I've mentioned, and he writes this up and sends it to Crowley. But it was not published in Crowley's lifetime or anything like that. Apparently what happened, according to the internal evidence that that he actually writes within the piece itself, he was asked for a copy of it by, was it Gerald York or Kenneth Grant? Yeah, Gerald York, who was a great collector of Crowleyana, and Gerald York said that there should really be a copy of this existing in England. So Achad made a typescript copy of it and sent it to Gerald York, but he wanted to make it clear that it was not to be copied without his express permission. And now the internet exists.
And he is incapable of giving his express permission. So it looks like the climax of the Master of the Temple paper is Crowley setting Jones an exam for the grade of Zealoter. And this is like 1913. He's aiming for Zealoter in 1918. And then in 1916, he's taking the, it doesn't say taking the Oath of the Abyss in this paper, but says that proclaimed his intention to claim the grade of 8.3. So maybe he did take the Oath of the Abyss much earlier. And then when we see 1916, he's been proclaiming his intention to take the Oath.
Because the Oath of the Abyss itself is to see every...
interpret every phenomenon as a particular dealing of God with my soul is one of the most famous articles, but I think there's a few things you have to sign off on. Now, he does say that after his great initiation on June 21st, 1916, that he becomes a neophyte, and then says he never claimed any grade higher than neophyte, but by which he means I never actually claimed to be an ipsissimus. I became an ipsissimus, and then I pretended to still be a neophyte.
Yeah, so what you're referring to there is as soon as he gets past the abyss, he initially has this... I guess he starts having realizations that seem to align with him having bypassed Crowley on the path and gone straight to ipsissimus, which is the top of the very tippy top of the tree. And so he's got this quandary that he's grappling with, where he's convinced that he's seeing evidence that he's advanced further than he was intending to. And, of course, Crowley's telling him just to focus on the work of the master of a temple. And meanwhile, there's this whole idea that he initially thought that he was going to become a master of a temple specifically to enable Crowley to become a 9 = 2.
Yeah, this seems like a very bad way to start. When I proclaimed my intention of claiming the grade of 8-3, or Master of the Temple, on June 21st in 1916 in the city of North Vancouver, British Columbia, I did so because I thought that his master Therion needed Nemo, one of the titles of the 8-3, in order to fulfill that office, in order that he might fully attain to his 9-2. So he's claiming sort of a humility here, that he didn't actually, he wasn't actually after the grade of Master of the Temple. He didn't necessarily think he was ready for it, or although that's me contextualizing. But for some reason, his primary motive is just to fill the office so his master can move on to the next place, which seems to me a bad motive, but there you are, and so this happens. He proclaims this on June 21st, 1916. He claims that the details of the initiation which followed are recorded in another place, but then a paragraph immediately before what I read, he said, hardly a word of the experience then undergone has been recorded. In fact, that is also true to some extent of the initiation on June 21st, 1916, the record of which I am only now trying to put into writing. So within one paragraph, he makes two sort of confusing errors, maybe I'm just not understanding, but June 21st, 1916 is when he decides to become a master of the temple, but June 21st, 1916 is also when he undergoes the great initiation. So he decides to become a master of the temple in my reading, and then attains the grade of master of the temple in the same day, never writes anything about it, but then tells you that the complete record is somewhere else, and then he says, yes, the very next day, the curse of the Magus came onto me quite unexpectedly, so that I could do naught else but consider myself to be 9-2, and then following a terrible struggle, for I realize I now had failed so far to complete the attainment because of a certain glamour of the path. I then decided to give up all, even the least little thing, and I made certain pledges, which were afterwards faithfully kept, so that I gave up my business position and got down to spending the last cent of my money. Having made these pledges, it seemed quite certain that I was on the path of LF, which united Chokmah with the crown, and therefore beyond the glamour of the great magician. I hoped that Therion had at that time attained to 10-1, and I was ready even then, if need be, to hold the grade of 9-2, and to accept the curse thereof. So within one day, within, let's say, 72 hours, he decides to become a master of the temple, becomes a master of the temple, hangs out there for 20 hours, then becomes a magus, then makes a play at Ipsissimus, and then, sort of falters and decides he's a neophyte. But he doesn't really decide he's a neophyte. He decides with humility to accept the title of neophyte just because he's into these reversals. So 10-1 becomes 110, and then that makes him a Buddha of compassion because he attained Nibbana, and instead of letting himself die, he came back to teach.
Yeah, I think you were initially starting this discussion with pointing out that you didn't feel drawn to his writings initially. And this is one of those cases where this is the type of thing that I feel like kind of would tend to turn me off of him, is the fact that there's this false sincerity, it seems like, where in this case, he could be completely sincere for all I know, but it sounds very much like he's trying to have it both ways, where he's like, well, I know that I've surpassed Crowley and I'm at 10 equals 1 and, I am essentially God now, but I'm gonna also be as humble as possible. He's clearly being snarky in himself, within himself, but it's like,
It shows internal conflict, at least. And what the nature of that conflict is, I don't know. Maybe it means he knows that his claims are dubious and doesn't fully trust himself, and so he's hedging. Maybe it means that he's just intimidated by his master and knows his master won't buy it, so he doesn't want to have that conversation. We'll see later in the paper how he sort of dances around the edges of it with Crowley to try to confirm his instincts here. And we'll see later various bits and pieces from his record, which are not recorded at the time, but recorded 2 years later in 1918, where he describes something. And it's unclear to me whether he's trying to describe his experience of crossing the abyss or some experience he's had subsequent to that, because he talks about initiations coming on him again, which is not weird. You can have these abyssal experiences again and again and again. That's okay. One way of thinking of the experience of crossing is of perfecting your samadhi. And so if that's how you think of it, then you would want to make samadhi regularly on different objects and stuff after that. But the way he describes the crossing of the abyss experience, if that is indeed what he's trying to lay out in this paper, is very, very weird to me. And I can say more about that later, but trying to lay out this story of what's happening with the initiation and how Crowley sort of, and how he feels about it and how Crowley sort of feels about it, is the sort of thrust of this whole diary entry that takes place on September 2nd in 1918. So the first big chunk of this paper is kind of trying to trace out the story of his initiation and sort of how weird it was. And when is he hospitalized? Is that maybe sort of in those 3 days too?
No, I think it kind of bleeds into that. So those 3 days were in 1916, and I think the hospitalization situation happens in 1917.
Okay.
And it's, as I say, it sort of seems to blend into it. I think there's he's referring to being on a train or a steamer, which I guess is a ship. And he's having various experiences of this initiation while he's on this steamer, and he's that kind of blends into the finding himself among all the enlightened Buddhas and whatnot, but in reality, he's surrounded by all the lowest filth.
I see. Because here, when he says the curse of the great of the Magus came upon him the day after his abyssal crossing, he then later says that that's part of him Yes, having done this, I felt myself to be one with the Buddhas of compassion and returned to Sorer R, as elsewhere recorded. Again, he keeps saying elsewhere recorded, but he also says that nothing has been written down, so I'm very confused.
Yeah, it's mixed up with a lot of other information, and this is one of the things that I found daunting about this, approaching this paper, is just trying to find a cohesive way of approaching it is a little tricky. It's a lot of it's really interesting, and if you're at all grounded in basic Hermetic Kabbalah and Thelemic Kabbalah and whatnot, especially, then it's pretty fascinating, because it's where that whole the word El becomes so very important. Not just that, but the idea of not and God both simultaneously existing simultaneous, and that being somehow intrinsically important to Thelema is here really put forth with startling clarity if you're able to read it, without getting completely lost in the weeds.
So maybe we should say something about the profundity of what Achad's claim here is. So if you read Crowley's Liber 418, that's his record of crossing the abyss, which he does sort of by accident. He's just trying to get the rest of the Enochian aethers, and then he discovers that one of the aethers is representative of the abyss and guarded by a demon appropriate to the abyss, and so he sort of gets across by magical means there, and the date of that is something like 1909. Mm-hmm. And it takes him, a month and a half or something like that, doing one aether every day, with a few exceptions. There are sometimes when he's told to approach and go back. And then that takes a while to stabilize, and he needs to really understand the mystery of sorrow, which is what he keeps telling Achad that he should be working on now as an 8-3. And of course, this is after a whole lifetime of a career as a magician, going all the way up through the grades of the AA, getting your knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel, and then coming up to the tip top of the tree where you have the first, second, and third Sephira. And then here in 1916, so 5 years later, is when Achad says that he voluntarily chooses to cross the abyss sort of as an act of generosity to give Crowley the gift of someone who could be qualified to be a master of the temple, so that he can then go and become a magus. So it takes Crowley 5 years to get from master of the temple to magus, and he needs to have a number of internal experience, but also to have trained someone up behind him to fill that spot. And then once he's a magus, he gets cursed. There's something called the Curse of the Magus, and you can read about this in the Kaczynski book, the Perturabo, it's called.
Okay, yeah. And
there are Chokmah is like the second Sephiroth, but it's the ninth grade, so which is why 9 equals 2. And so he has 9 periods of 72 days of just being broke and miserable. That take him through the grade of Magus before that's really internalized, and he can even think about, what it might look like to approach the path of Aleph. And Achad is claiming that he decided to be master of the temple, same day became master of the temple, next day Magus,
Curse of the Magus, next
day done with the Curse of the Magus and ready to approach the path of the left and make a real run at the Absissimus. And then because he knows that might be, once he realizes that Crowley has not, in less than a week gone from Chokmah to Kether, he decides not to claim superiority over the great beast and just just coyly flips the numbers around and claims the grade of neophyte. And he says, then the correspondence began between myself and Therion. He admitted my grade of 8.3, but would not consider the possibility of the path of Aleph, 10.1, etc., explaining my taking 1.10 again as my being cast out into Malkuth, although as a matter of fact, I made no claim except to neophyte. Because I was being a condescending, because I was being a passive-aggressive little bitch. As he also realized that this must be the child prophesied unto him in Liber Legis, and then claimed me as his son. So this letter was not received poorly. It doesn't say when this letter was sent. It just says there was correspondence between myself and Therion, and so something that happened must have been recorded, whether it was fully and it must have been, at least in Crowley's estimation, fairly clearly a good crossing of the abyss experience, at least a period of internal silence long enough to sort of qualify, or deep enough to sort of qualify. But then he says all that other stuff is sort of nonsense, and later he'll say focus on the mystery of sorrow.
Well, it's I think one of the things that's been argued with regard to this this story is that Crowley was probably overeager and was doing what he was warned against doing in Liber 418. In one of the visions, there's the Nemo is portrayed as a man tending gardens, and he cares not which one will be the next Nemo. And so I've heard it argued that Crowley, tried too hard to focus on tending that one particular plant to the exclusion of all others. So there's that way of looking at it. But then again, I mean, the way that this is being portrayed, I could totally see if Crowley was overeager and maybe petty about the idea of him trying to be bigger than his britches kind of thing. You could expect Crowley to be, they could well have had a falling out right then and there. Anything else.
And they didn't. So
no.
that's a testament to the master's patience, which
I think
is not his most famous quality.
Yeah, he doesn't come off as the way that we tend to think of Crowley as being this impatient, hard-headed kind of person who's dismissive and that sort of thing. He's actually very patient and doesn't come off at all that kind of way.
I'm doing my, I sort of recently finished my student task for, I recently finished my probation for AA. Mm-hmm. And
congratulations.
Even as little as you understand it, you should proclaim everywhere your affiliation or whatever, because secrecy is the enemy of truth or something like that. So I might as well say it. And I got shit from my neophyte for the incompleteness of my record when I submitted it, and I cannot imagine how this would have happened, Charles Stansfeld Jones crossing the abyss in one day with no record. And the most important AA person, the founder of the AA, was like, "Oh, cool."
So there might have been an aspect of Crowley just being like, "No, this is great. I've got somebody to do this thing and to prove the AA system and to be my magical child."
Or Jones misspeaks when he says, "I'm only trying to write this down now." Maybe that's a way of trying to tell which story.
Or maybe it's
true.
With more clarity now that he's writing it than it was, anything was, maybe it was very scant what he did have.
Yeah, because there's so much when you're working with these primary source materials is how to interpret things that, what they say plainly is not always what they say, especially when they contain internal contradictions like this. So maybe there was some sort of a record. I hope so. He says nothing much happened. Got this thing about the air being his balance. He equilibrated a bunch of stuff. The path of Aleph and Shin. He was given a magical gesture, now not clear to me. Again, I underlined that just because it underlines the importance of keeping records as you go. Like, how could he let that pass? Especially if he was able to use it to change the weather and stuff like this, as he says. And then in March of 19, I sold all that I had in order to join Therion in New York.
And I think Crowley later was not happy about that either. He thought it was a really bad idea for him to do that.
A little bit rash, maybe?
Yeah, I wish I could remember the exact context of him thinking that was a bad idea. But I think that might have been, later on when they started having falling out and all that. I think Crowley, in hindsight, felt like...
I know that Achad is a musician. He's like a piano player who works in like bars and lounges. And,
I just thought he was an accountant.
Am I...
I've never heard that he was a piano player. But, it doesn't mean that you're wrong. I just knew, I think I looked up the Wikipedia for him, and I think in early life, it basically says he was born on such and such a date and became an accountant. And I was like, wow, at 0?
That's really funny. Okay, so he's a bookkeeping person? Who the hell am I thinking of? I must be wrong about this.
I'm not sure.
This is one for the blooper reels, maybe. But I thought, because he talks about, living on the beach with his wife and 3 kids because they can't afford a home and shit.
Yeah.
And then this thing where it says sold all he owned, I was like,
sounds like a musician.
Is that because he needed the money to pay for the train ticket, or because he just wouldn't want to be burdened by putting the stuff in storage? I thought he just seems to be perpetually broke. And I just always assumed that was because he was like this local small-time gigging jazz pianist. I don't know where I heard that. But if he's an accountant, then...
Like I say, you're not necessarily wrong, but I don't recall anything related to the idea that he was a musician, so there's a possibility that might be spurious.
Maybe I'm just thinking of someone else.
Very possible.
Christ.
Oh, you might be thinking of Jazzy Jazzerson.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It's Crowley's other magical.
Frater Jazzy Jazzerson, yeah.
Frater, get down. Frater, feel the funk. So the next thing, we've gotten as far as I sold all that I owned in order to join Therion in New York, and then I have the next paragraph highlighted as something to read out. Is there anything leading up to that point that you want to go over before we move on to the next phase of our journey here?
Just preceding that last sentence that you read, I will point out that the whole paragraph preceding that basically starts getting into the al and la, or el and lo kind of ideas, which apparently he initially started making in connection with his name of Parzival, which was his OTO moniker. So he started looking at the name Parzival backwards and breaking it up into 3 separate sort of words. And he lists them as lo, because the last 2 letters are A-L, so backwards would be L-A, the Hebrew word lo, or no, or not. And so then he ends up breaking he has that followed by ziv, or viz backwards, which is enumerated to, in Hebrew Kabbalah, enumerates to 106, and that equals to the word for attained. And followed by the final part of the word, which is par, but backwards would give rap, which equals crown. And I failed to look these things up just to verify them, but I guess we'll take his word for it for the time being.
Well, yes, it's going to be important for what he wants to talk about later. So he's just discovering more of the mystery of his own motto, but some of this, becomes getting those words in his mind, the lo and the L.
Crown and ashes, I should say. I missed that one, and that's actually important as well.
Mm-hmm. So he says he's going to visit Therion in New York, and he says, quite recently, I was impressed to resign from the OTO and to withdraw my help in that direction, and having done so, I felt a wonderful calm and a realization of entering into the Tao. It was only then that I began to seriously consider that I had passed him on the path and attained 10-1. Also, the question arose as to whether he might not think so also. Yesterday I had a long talk with him, because he had raised the point that going back over past lives he had discovered that each new life was an added veil of the true self or star, and therefore the star was to be found by going back to the beginning. This seemed a new idea to him, but I could not help thinking of my experience, and how I had actually done this, and got there and become one with the final mystery in December of 1917. And yesterday, when I talked to him, he seemed on his guard, so that when I asked him about the mystery of change, he referred me to the fact, as he says, that in my grade 8-3 I should constantly apply myself to the mystery of sorrow. Then I suddenly asked him what he thought of the number 31, and where it should be placed on the tree of life, and he said, this number has to do with the identity of nothing and the Trinity, and if anything refers to Ayin, or perhaps to Kether, but certainly to no lower Sephira. Then I thanked him and said no more. And so the profundity of this is that the number 31 refers to Kether, which is the place where the 10-1 resides, the ipsissimus, the highest possible grade for an AA initiate. And Achad had recently been receiving Kabbalistic sort of inspiration that included interpretations of the number 31 as El and Lo. But they were only to do with his name at this point. It seems like he hadn't started connecting to the Book of the Law and realizing the profundity of them yet. But he's taking this as verification, subtle verification that he has in fact attained the highest, surpassed his master on the path and attained the highest grade possible to an AA initiate, and possibly the highest grade possible to an incarnate being. So, I think one can have inspiration about numbers at any time. It doesn't necessarily mean, if I have an inspiration about, 65, like a new idea about what that might mean, I wouldn't immediately start claiming that I had attained knowledge. The only way I could have possibly know this is that I'd attained the knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel or something. And when he says that he had actually gone back to the beginning, it's not clear what he means by this. Within the context of this paper, the only thing we have is this 10-1-1-10 thing, which is purely symbolic. It's about what grades he's attaining. It's not like what Crowley's saying about deep paths, life regression, going all the way back to your first incarnation as a human being and seeing what that guy was up to, so that you could then have a pattern on which to, like, one experience is much, much more profound than the other, and Achad doesn't seem capable of realizing this.
Yeah, it seems, he had this vision, essentially, I guess we can call it, that he was laying out where, I don't know if we missed it. This is the thing, it's so easy to get lost in this paper. I don't know if we already passed it or if he's coming up on it, but he has this vision of everything wheeling back to the beginning of the creation of the universe, and then he has to, his job is to set creation back in motion again.
Yeah, no, that's going to come in the third section when he tries to lay out something about what the initiation was actually like. There's sort of 3 large diary chunks in here, and the first one is about the story of his relationship with Crowley and what he claims happened to him with his grade initiations. Then the second one is his analysis of Liber L. And then I think the third one is where he actually attempts to give some account of his own initiatory experience. I may have section 2 and 3 backwards.
That's the trickiness of having a piece like this, which is really diary entries and then writing after the fact to try and add to them, not necessarily clarify them, but add to them. It's a difficult, it's like you're reading the Enochian John Dee's diaries or John Dee's manuscripts. a lot of it does make sense and has a linearity to it, but it's like there's in following it out and trying to find any changes that were made through the course of things. It's very difficult because it's not all strictly recorded, at least in the papers that we have. So it's hard to know what's reading diaries is not an easy task for recreating an actual history.
Reading diaries is not an easy task to begin with, but when the diary entries are like written 2 years too late and in a very in sort of an inside speak, where we've been doing Thelema stuff long enough that I think we understand at least most of the buzzwords. So that solves that problem for us. But the fact that Achad may be misremembering large sections of this stuff too,
or assuming, taking it for granted, like for instance what you were just referring to, where he's talking about going back to previous incarnations and whatnot, and he's referring to it as if he's just been talking about it or something like that, and it's sort of like maybe that's included in that later vision that's described, but it's because it's all sort of out of order and it's not clear. It doesn't all come together as easily for us as third parties.
I have a question here. Is this about? Is this a couple more paragraphs down where he talks about the great magician? Does he mean the path of Aleph, the great magician, the fool, the? Oh no, the great magician would be the path of Beth, connecting Bina to Kether. Is this a whole passage about Kabbalah, or is this more about his relationship with Crowley? Because I could also imagine someone calling Crowley the great magician. And the first 5 words are, the great magician denies me, which he's just explained how the great magician denies his attainment. So I don't know what this means, but it seems to be important, so I'm going to read it anyway. The great magician denies me, saying that I am not IA or Nemo 83, and in this he fulfilleth his office of cutting off the understanding from the crown, which is God, El. In this very thing he is the incarnation of the mystery of change. El, Kether, is reflected into Chokmah as Lo, and the Magus looketh upon the crown along the path of Aleph, which is 0, and perceiveth it not. The Magister Templi understands, for the word of Chokmah Lo is truly reflected into Bina as El, and therefore the Magus appeareth to him as God, where the crown, the true El, is reflected through the path of Beth to Lo, and he sees nothing in that direction because of the lies of the great illusion of Maya, the magician, but he striveth by Aleph to the Magus, who is the great deceiver. Thus it is that above the abyss a thing is only true insofar as it is its own opposite. This is the final and complete understanding of the mystery of the grade given to me now, at 2:38 p.m. For never before have I seen things thus. And so there is some profundity here. And we could go through this and try to tease out the meaning of the argument, but since it refers to the picture of things above the abyss, I don't know how helpful it would be.
The biggest takeaway here is below the abyss, we have the workings of normal consciousness existing. Above the abyss, it's beyond our normal consciousness, and so things don't work the same way, and we can't. So anything we talk about right now is going to be speculative. But the interesting thing that's coming out of this is especially the idea of reflections. We have this idea of God and not. We have the idea being reflected, going from being God to being not, depending on where you are within that highest triad. And interestingly enough, as Crowley was alluding to, quoted by Achad earlier, El or Lo both equate to 31, and 31 is graphically, it's a 3 and a 1, so it's sort of like 3 in 1, and it's kind of talking about the supernal triad.
This is interesting here too. This idea that Chokmah is low and Kether is El, and then Binah is either low or El, depending on whether it's receiving Chokmah or receiving Kether, because as sort of the mediator between the supernal triad and the rest of the tree of life, Binah has to kind of be flexible enough to receive and transmit whatever the two upper spheres have to give her, and this is another reason why Binah is the seat of the holy whore in Thelema. Whore meaning like she just takes all comers. When you're coming up the abyss, crossing the abyss, it's the love of Babylon that draws you across the abyss. And I guess this is showing how coming down, she's equally flexible in how she receives the light of God, whether it's from the single point or from the sort of dualistic, reflections. But the reason I underlined this to read, I think initially, is that in Liber 5, we practiced that ritual for a while, right? And when you're facing west, in that ritual, you say, before me the powers of Lo, behind me the powers of El, at my
right hand the powers of Lo, at my left hand the powers of El.
So are you sitting at the Doth point, doing that ritual with Kether behind you, the whole tree of life before you, and then Chokmah on your left, and Binah on your right, or Binah both beside you and before you, because she's the expanse of the great sea.
I was thinking of it in terms of like you've got Babylon before you and Nuit to your right, so those are the low points, and then you have El with the two masculine points. So I always associated that with the positive and negative in Kabbalistic terms, but that's an interesting to relate it to the idea of being at Da'ath potentially.
Yeah, and again, thinking of it as being like either a ritual of drawing in the energies of the new aeon, you're at that point filtering the light down from heaven into the world, but also Da'ath is the fallen Sephira, and so think of it being a ritual for the invocation of evil. That's also the way the word of the Magus is true but always misunderstood. There's something about that makes sense for a ritual like that to be performed from that point. And the energy of it, the fact that you're supposed to be dancing and stuff. There's there's a sort of, depending on what kind of a dancer you are, there could potentially be quite a chaotic, quite a chaotic mess going on there, like as if the demon sea were kind of at work. So, where to next?
He does start to put together the idea that he sees himself as the magical child.
And Crowley sees him as the magical child, too. And I think the best evidence for this is this key of Al and Lo. Right at the beginning here, Crowley says, "Your key opens palace. Liber 220 has unfolded like a flower. All solved. Even chapter 2, verse 76 and chapter 3, verse 47. And then 276 is the numerical code, and then 347 is this line. In this line drawn is a key, which are two of the most perplexing parts, and Crowley says Achad has solved them, even though Achad later says he hasn't. So more confusion. But there are good reasons, even though I'm skeptical that Achad was successful in his crossing. A lot of the stuff that he brings back with him about the interpretation of Liberal, it's the standard way we interpret it now, thinking of Nuit as being Ayin and Hadith as being Kether, and at least in some schools, this has become sort of the standard Kabbalistic model. So
yeah, and there's a lot. I mean, you can pick out a lot of stuff in here on the subject to meditate upon, and it's really worthwhile meditating upon. There's a lot you can get out of that.
Yes, here what he gets in all of these words is he's starting to realize the ubiquity of this self-not-self dualism, where there is only one God and Muhammad is his prophet. Even though that seems to be a monistic statement, by including the prophet, you're setting up the self-not-self dualism. He also talks about the mystery of 93 for Kether is 31, Chokmah is 31, and Bina is 31, which adds to 93. I mean, this is because of that pattern of L's and lows that we were talking about. Crowley will, either Achad or Crowley will adapt this in the next couple of years before when Liber V is written to be El Lo Sht. But he's starting to put some of that stuff together. He has the enumeration of his name, Achad, which is 13, being another reversal, and talking about the relationship between unity and love. Allah, the Magus 92, Allah, of course, he says, because the Book of the Law says spelling is defunct, you don't need to include the H, the Aleph, Lamed, Lamed, Aleph, it is enough to spell Allah, so that even the name of the Mohammedan God also talks about this positive negative dualism, and he's just going to go on about that for a little while. He reverses his own initiation name, which had been VIO-OIV and now is OIV-VIO. And this starts to think of this idea as no God, as being, when does he get to the point where it's important for the Book of the Law? Yeah, here, a few paragraphs down. The first thing he says, chapter 1, verse 46, nothing is the secret key of this law. 61, the Jews call it. I call it 880, 418. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, so he's immediately going to explain that Parzival, his moniker for the OTO, is 8, 80, and 418. So insofar as it's 8 letters, the initial P is enumerated to 80, and the overall enumeration of the name is 418. I think in our Reguli talk, we weren't sure about how he got to that, but there was a few different names that we weren't sure how they all added up and all that sort of thing. But I guess if we weren't getting this one, neither of us was considering the Z in Parzival to be in Hebrew taken as Tzadi.
Yeah, Zadi instead of Zion, because that's the only sort of counterintuitive move you have to make, and everything adds up just lovely. Mm-hmm. Something else he does here that's pretty neat is because Parzival, we talked about before how Parzival is the fool because he's dressed in motley clothes or whatever, so that he doesn't become a knight by accident. And so that makes him a cute representative of the Fool card, who, even though it's called the Fool, it's man starting out on his adventure, right? So he says Parzival is the Fool, which on the tarot is Aleph, even though it's the card number 0. Aleph makes it 1. And so if the Jews have 61, the Jews have it, but they have the half and none by the book.
61 being Ayin.
Which that's what they call nothing. Or that's the word, that's one of their words for the veils of not, Ayin Sof, that sort of primordial non-stuff of creation. And Nuit is saying how this stuff that is kind of my jam, the veil of heaven. 61, the Jews call it, Ayin Sof, or 61 is just Ayin. But they have the half and none by the book. And so Parzival is saying that the other half should be 1. So he can get to 62, and then have mysteries applicable to 62, which is twice 31, and shows Al and Lo. And I think that's okay, because especially since the first move in manifestation, after you have Kether, you immediately have the path of Aleph down to Chokmah, and so that's the inspiration of the Ayin. So if Nuit is 61 and Hadith is Kether, that makes him 1, and so you add 61 and 1. That completes the formula and inspires the sort of movement of the light down the tree, that lightning flash, which begins in Aleph. On the path of Aleph, I had at some point been trying to figure this out. So 880, 418. If you look at verse 8. You get Kabs is in the Ku, not the Ku in the Kabs. So again, this relationship between self and not self, the deep identity of the individual, the interior star, is within the light, not the light. It's not the light house. That's the self. And so this supports Achad's suggestion about Lo and Al, and it's also tangentially the reason why Thelema, the main point of contention between Thelema and existentialism, because for existentialists, existence precedes essence. So you have you would have your whatever you were, the light, your body radiating out, behaving in the world, and then your behavior would make up your essence. Whereas for Thelema, we're essentialists, so we think you come into the world with something, and then that something creates a life around you, and that's important because these are two, at least for my money, the two major movements inspired by Nietzsche. Nietzsche is the prophet of the existentialists, but he's also the prophet of Thelema. An early prophet of Thelema. So it's important to know where the difference of interpretation is, and this is a fundamental mental thing for not getting distracted by Sartre. Verse 80 is going to be chapter 2, verse 14. Now let there be a veiling of this shrine. Now let the light devour men and eat them up with blindness.
Cool.
Again, we're getting sort of overcome. For verse 61, 61, the Jews call it, we have this long section that says, "But to love me is better than all things. If under the night sky in the desert thou presently burnest mine incense before me." So really very much about Nuit's mystery and the relationship of the one with the all, because it's how this is Crowley's instruction, a prophecy about how he's actually going to cross the abyss, right? Under the night stars in the desert, presently burnest mine incense before me. This is the working that receives 418, and then the last number 880, 418. So if you want to understand the mystery of this passage, 61 the Jews call it. I call it 880, 418. And Achad's right. They're all verses that have to do with the individual being dissolved in the infinite, Al and Lo, self not self dualism, and what becomes for Crowley, probably already is for Crowley, the 0 = 2 equation. So.
Yeah, I mean, Crowley did have that 0 = 2 equation from very early on, before having received the Book of the Law. Where did he first discuss that? It was like in a paper, I think it was in...
He refers to people to a note in ontology, Bereshit, a note in ontology. a lot when he wants to talk about the sort of model of the universe and how like something comes out of nothing, and then the relationship of the aspirant to his god and how those things then resolve back to zero. It's his sort of model of how attainment works. But then Bereshit talks about that paper talks about the what he calls the three great schools of philosophy, which is like monism, dualism, and I think nihilism. Monism being like a Catholic perspective where God sort of is everything, or maybe like a Hindu perspective where like if God makes the universe, he has to make it from himself because he's the only substance available. And then the dualist perspective being like, I guess, like creator creature. And then the nihilistic perspective being the Buddhist perspective, where the truth is that nothing exists, and you just want to get back to that because you're mistaken in sorrow. But he tries to reconcile all three of those doctrines and talk about what you can sort of understand.
Do you mind if I read a little passage from Liber 418?
Please.
I'm thinking this actually pertains very strongly to what we have here as well, and Achad does actually refer to it also at some point. It's from the fifth Ether, which is where Crowley directly encounters the inner order of the AA, the Silver Star. And now I come to the top of the mountain, and the last pylon opens into a circular hall, with other pylons leading out of it, each of which is the last pylon of a great avenue. There seem to be 9 such pylons, and in the center is a shrine, a circular table, supported by marble figures of men and women, alternate white and black. They face inwards, and their buttocks are almost worn away by the kisses of those who have come to worship that supreme God, who is the single end of all those diverse religions. But the shrine itself is higher than a man may reach. But the angel that was with me lifted me, and I saw that the edge of the altar, as I must call it, was surrounded by holy men. Each has in his right hand a weapon, one a sword, one a spear, one a thunderbolt, and so on. But each with his left hand gives the sign of silence. I wish to see what is within their ring. One of them bends forward so that I may whisper the password. The angel prompts me to whisper, "There is no God." So they let me pass, and though there was indeed nothing visible therein, yet there was a very strange atmosphere, which I could not understand. Suspended in the air there is a silver star, and on the forehead of each of the guardians there is a silver star. It is a pentagram, because, says the angel, 3 and 5 are 8, 3 and 8 are 11. There is another numerical reason that I cannot hear. And as I entered their ring, they bade me stand in their circle, and a weapon was given unto me. And the password that I had given seems to have been whispered round from one to the other, for each one nods gravely as if in solemn acquiescence, until the last one whispers the same words in my ears. But they have a different sense. I had taken them to be a denial of the existence of God. But the man who says them to me evidently means nothing of the sort. What he does mean, I cannot tell at all. He slightly emphasized the word there. And there's a little bit of a reference to the idea that he attempts to guess that maybe in that individual place is no God, but that's because God is in all things, is all around us and that sort of thing, but he's not clear on it. He doesn't have a clear conception at this moment.
Sure, emphasizing the word there, like...
There is no God.
There is no... Yeah. I mean, there's in the Book of the Law, it also, Hadith says something like, there is no God. I am alone and there is no God where I am.
Yeah.
Is that Hadith or Nuit?
Hadith says that, yeah.
So it makes it even clearer. There is no God where I am. There may be some gods somewhere else. But
I like the fact that it's like there is no God. There is Lo-El.
Yeah, but yeah, I for some reason I was remembering that passage slightly emphasized the word is. There is no God, like as if no God was the name of the deity that positively is. But yeah, there is a weird interpretation. It's like pointing to a painting or something. It's like, if you want to know what the image of God is, there is no God. There it is.
Thanks for listening. Watch for part 2 of our discussion on Liber 31. Look for Toronto Thelema on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Watch for events in the city. And join us again in the darkly splendid abodes.
9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. All right, maybe we can... This just says, thou shalt obtain the order and value of the English alphabet, so maybe I've made a mistake.
No, I was going to say maybe you're the magical child. But,
more stuff for the cutting room floor.